For 18 consecutive days, Corporal Jake Mitchell dropped more equipment than he carried, tripped over tripwires during training exercises, and fumbled with explosive devices so badly that his instructor started questioning whether he understood the difference between a detonator and a dinner fork. His hands shook during every bomb disposal simulation. His timing was consistently off by dangerous margins. And yesterday he'd actually managed to set off a training device while trying to disarm it. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit at Fort Brennan had seen plenty of washouts, but Mitchell was developing a reputation as someone who might actually blow himself up during a safety briefing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the EAD training compound as Corporal Jake Mitchell stepped off the transport bus, his duffel bag slung awkwardly over one shoulder. At 26, he had the lean build of someone who'd grown up working with his hands, though nothing about his current performance suggested any particular manual dexterity. His uniform was regulation perfect, pressed and creased with military precision, but there was something slightly off about the way he wore it, like a costume that almost fit but didn't quite belong. His assignment papers crinkled in the desert wind as he approached the administrative building. The compound stretched out before him, a collection of concrete structures and specialized training areas where the Army's best learned to defuse the deadliest weapons ever conceived. Somewhere in the distance, a controlled detonation sent a small tremor through the ground, reminding everyone within miles that this was serious business. Staff Sergeant Patricia Vega looked up from her paperwork as Mitchell entered the office, her expression already settling into the practiced neutrality of someone who'd processed hundreds of new arrivals over the years. She had the weathered look of a career NCO, someone who'd earned her stripes through competence rather than politics. And her desk was arranged with the kind of functional efficiency that suggested zero tolerance for nonsense. Mitchell presented his orders with a slight fumble, nearly dropping the folder before catching it against his chest. Vega's eyebrow ticked upward almost imperceptibly as she scanned the documents. His previous assignments read like a tour of the Army's least explosive specialties: motor pool mechanic, supply clerk, administrative assistant. Nothing that suggested any experience with the kind of precision work that kept EOD technicians alive. The paperwork indicated he'd volunteered for the program, which was unusual enough to merit attention. Most soldiers ended up in EOD through one of three routes: exceptional aptitude identified during initial training, disciplinary reassignment for those who needed structure, or voluntary transfer from soldiers seeking additional technical challenges. Mitchell's file suggested none of these typical pathways, just a simple request for specialty training with minimal justification. Vega handed him a key card and a schedule printed on paper that still smelled like fresh toner. Building C, 3rd floor, room 318. Orientation begins at 0600 tomorrow. Don't be late and don't touch anything that looks even remotely explosive until someone specifically tells you it's safe to breathe near it. The compound has a perfect safety record this quarter, and we'd like to keep it that way. The barracks smelled like industrial soap and the particular mixture of nervousness and determination that defined military training environments. Mitchell claimed a bunk near the windows, arranging his gear with careful attention to regulation spacing while his new roommates sized him up with the casual assessment soldiers applied to anyone who might end up watching their backs in dangerous situations. His roommate turned out to be Specialist Danny Chun, a compact dynamo from California who'd been in the program for 6 weeks and had opinions about everything. Chun had the rapid-fire speaking style of someone who processed information faster than most people could follow, and he'd apparently appointed himself as the unofficial orientation coordinator for new arrivals. "So you're the new guy," Chun said, not really waiting for confirmation. "What's your background? Please tell me you've at least seen a bomb before. because the last guy they sent us thought C4 was a vitamin supplement. He transferred out after accidentally activating a training device during the safety briefing. Took 3 instructors to talk him down from the ceiling. Mitchell's response was carefully measured, the kind of non-answer that provided information without actually saying anything useful. Previous experience mostly involved mechanical systems, basic electronics, some industrial work. Nothing too exciting, just looking for a change of pace and the chance to learn something new. Chun studied him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Change of pace? Brother, EOD isn't a change of pace. It's a change of species. We're talking about devices specifically designed to kill anyone who gets close enough to matter. One wrong move and you're not just having a bad day, you're having your last day. You sure you know what you signed up for? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their remaining roommates, a collection of soldiers representing the full spectrum of military personality types. There was Rodriguez, a soft-spoken Texan who'd apparently blown things up professionally before joining the Army. Williams, whose nervous energy suggested someone still processing the reality of his career choice, and Thompson, who had the quiet confidence of someone who'd already proven himself in other contexts. As the evening wore on, Mitchell found himself relegated to the role of observer rather than participant in the group's discussions. The others swapped stories about their backgrounds, shared concerns about upcoming evaluations, and gradually established the social dynamics that would define their time in training. Mitchell contributed just enough to avoid seeming antisocial, while revealing almost nothing about himself beyond basic biographical details. When lights out was called, he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling while his roommates settled into sleep around him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through the windows, the compound security lights cast geometric patterns on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, the low hum of generators provided a constant reminder that this place operated according to different rules than the rest of the world. The first training session began before dawn with a safety briefing that could have doubled as a horror movie script. Master Chief William Torres stood at the front of the classroom, his presence commanding attention without apparent effort. He had the kind of calm authority that came from years of handling situations where mistakes had permanent consequences, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty about the subjects he was discussing. Torres began with statistics that focused everyone's attention immediately. In the past 12 months, improvised explosive devices had been responsible for 63% of combat casualties in active theaters. The average EOD technician would encounter over 200 explosive devices during a standard deployment, ranging from simple booby traps to sophisticated weapons capable of leveling entire buildings. The margin for error was precisely zero, because explosives didn't provide second chances or learning opportunities. The classroom was equipped with cutaway models of various explosive devices, each one representing a different approach to killing people efficiently. Torres moved among them like a professor discussing academic subjects, pointing out design features and mechanical principles with the same tone someone might use to explain automotive repair. This particular model uses a pressure plate trigger mechanism, he explained, indicating a device that looked like an innocent piece of road equipment. The explosive yield is sufficient to destroy an armored vehicle and anyone inside it. The triggering mechanism is sensitive enough that a child's bicycle could set it off. Mitchell took notes with the same diligent attention as everyone else, but Torres noticed something unusual about his questions. While most students asked about safety procedures or technical specifications, Mitchell's inquiries focused on design principles and manufacturing techniques. How much pressure was required for activation? What materials would be used in field-expedient construction? How might someone modify the basic design to defeat standard countermeasures? The question suggested someone thinking like an engineer, rather than just a technician. approaching the subject from the perspective of someone who understood systems rather than simply following procedures. It was an unusual mindset for someone supposedly new to the field, but not unprecedented. Some soldiers had natural aptitude for technical subjects that emerged when they encountered the right challenge. The practical training began with devices, so simple they barely qualified as explosive. Basic circuits, elementary triggering mechanisms, training charges with enough power to make noise without causing actual damage. The kind of equipment designed to build confidence while teaching. Fundamental principles. For most students, these initial exercises represented their first hands-on exposure to the reality of explosive ordnance disposal. Mitchell approached his first training device with visible nervousness, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the simple circuit board and battery pack that comprised the triggering mechanism. The device was designed to be obvious, with clearly marked components and color-coded wiring that made the correct procedure unmistakable. Even so, he fumbled with the wire cutters, dropped a crucial component, and managed to activate the buzzer that indicated improper handling. The instructor, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, watched with the patience of someone who'd seen every possible variation of beginners' mistakes. She had 15 years of EOD experience and the teaching skills that came from explaining life and death. Procedures to soldiers who'd never seen anything more complex than a smoke detector. Her approach emphasized methodical procedures over speed, understanding over memorization. "Take your time, Corporal," Santos said as Mitchell struggled with a connection that should have been straightforward. "This isn't a race, and the training devices won't actually hurt you. Focus on understanding what you're doing rather than just following steps. The real ones won't be nearly this forgiving, so we need to build proper habits now." Mitchell's performance over the following days established a pattern that concerned his instructors and amused his classmates. Simple tasks that other students mastered quickly seemed to confound him completely. His hands shook during delicate procedures, he confused basic components, and he consistently failed to complete exercises within the time parameters that indicated real-world competence. During one particularly frustrating session with a training mine designed to teach basic disarmament procedures, Mitchell managed to trigger the device 3 separate times while attempting to disconnect the same wire. Each activation sent a sharp electronic tone through the training bay, followed by a recorded message explaining that he'd just been killed by his own incompetence. Other students began to pause their own work to watch his struggles, and whispered conversations started to include speculation about how long he'd last in the program. Chun, who'd appointed himself as Mitchell's unofficial mentor, tried to provide encouragement during their evening discussions. "Look, everybody struggles with this stuff initially," he said while cleaning his gear with the precision that EA'd work demanded. "The learning curve is brutal because they can't afford to graduate anyone who isn't absolutely reliable. You just need to slow down, think through each step, and trust the procedures. The methods work if you follow them correctly." But Mitchell's difficulties seemed to go beyond normal learning challenges. He appeared to understand the theoretical principles better than most students, often providing correct answers during classroom discussions about explosive chemistry and electronic circuits. His written examinations consistently scored in the upper range, demonstrating solid comprehension of the academic material. The disconnect came during practical application, where his hands seemed incapable of executing procedures his mind clearly understood. Rodriguez, whose own background included construction demolition, offered a different perspective during one of their late-night conversations. "Maybe you're overthinking it," he suggested. "Sometimes when people know too much theory, they get paralyzed, trying to account for every possible variable instead of just following the basic steps. The procedures exist because they work, not because they're perfect. You might be trying to solve problems that don't actually exist." Williams, whose nervous energy hadn't diminished despite weeks of training, was more direct in his assessment. Dude, you look terrified every time you get near anything explosive. Like, genuinely scared. Maybe this just isn't your thing. There's no shame in recognizing that something isn't a good fit before you get yourself or someone else hurt. Better to transfer out now than wash out later. Thompson, who rarely contributed to group discussions, surprised everyone by offering his own observation. I've been watching him during the classroom sessions, he said quietly. He asks questions like someone who already knows the answers, but wants to confirm details. That's not how someone learns new material. That's how someone refreshes information. They already understand. The comment created an uncomfortable silence that lasted until Chun changed the subject to safer topics like weekend plans and family letters. But Thompson's observation lingered in everyone's mind, adding another layer to the puzzle that Mitchell represented. His combination of theoretical knowledge and practical incompetence didn't fit any pattern they'd encountered before. As the second week progressed, Mitchell's reputation as the class washout became firmly established. His failures weren't just consistent, they were spectacular. During an exercise with a simulated car bomb, he managed to activate the device while attempting to access the engine compartment, triggering a training explosion that would have destroyed everything within a 50-meter radius. The instructors used his mistake as a teaching moment about the importance of systematic search procedures. Santos pulled him aside after that particular disaster for a private conversation that felt more like a counseling session than professional instruction. "Corporal Mitchell," she began, her tone carrying the weight of someone delivering difficult news. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've seen every type of student who comes through this program. Some people have natural aptitude, some have to work harder but eventually succeed, and some discover that EA'd work isn't compatible with their particular skill set." Mitchell listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested someone accustomed to receiving criticism without reaction. Santos continued, describing the statistical reality that approximately 30% of students failed to complete the program, most within the first month. The work required a specific combination of technical knowledge, physical coordination, and psychological resilience that not everyone possessed. "Your theoretical understanding is actually quite good," Santos acknowledged. "Your test scores demonstrate solid comprehension of the material, and your questions during classroom sessions show you're thinking about the subject matter in sophisticated ways. But the practical component is equally important, and that's where you're struggling. The hands-on work requires muscle memory, confidence, and the ability to perform complex procedures under stress." She explained that Mitchell had 2 more weeks to demonstrate improvement before the program administrators would be forced to make decisions about his continued enrollment. The training pipeline had specific timelines and performance benchmarks that couldn't be adjusted for individual circumstances. Students who couldn't meet minimum standards, regardless of their potential or effort, had to be transferred to programs better suited to their capabilities. That evening, Mitchell sat alone in the common area long after his roommates had gone to sleep, studying technical manuals that covered material far beyond what they'd encountered in class. Chun discovered him there around midnight, surrounded by reference books that looked like they belonged in an engineering library rather than a basic training program. "Studying for tomorrow's practical?" Chun asked, settling into a nearby chair. "Because I've got to tell you, reading about procedures isn't going to help with the hands-on stuff. That comes from practice and repetition, not more theory." Mitchell closed the manual he'd been reading, but not before Chun caught a glimpse of diagrams that looked significantly more complex than anything they'd seen in class. "Just trying to understand the underlying principles better," Mitchell explained. "Sometimes when you comprehend why something works the way it does, the practical application becomes clearer." Chun studied his roommate with growing curiosity. The manual Mitchell had been reading was titled Advanced Explosive Device Analysis, Counter-IED, Techniques for Special Operations, which definitely wasn't on their required reading list. In fact, it looked like the kind of reference material that would be used in advanced courses, the kind reserved for soldiers who'd already proven themselves in basic EOD work. "Where did you get that book?" Chun asked directly. "Because I'm pretty sure it's not available in the base library, and it's definitely not something they'd give to students who are struggling with basic procedures." Mitchell's pause lasted just long enough to suggest he was carefully considering his response. "Found it in the reference section," he said finally. "I like to read ahead sometimes, try to get a broader perspective on the subject matter. Helps me understand how the basic techniques fit into larger operational contexts." It was a reasonable explanation that didn't quite account for why someone struggling with elementary procedures would be studying advanced countermeasures used by special operations units. Chun filed the observation away with the other inconsistencies he'd noticed about his roommate, adding it to a growing collection of details that didn't quite fit together. The third week began with news that elevated everyone's stress levels significantly. Torres announced that the program would be visited by Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for EOD training across the entire southeastern region. Hayes had a reputation as someone who maintained extremely high standards and had personally reviewed the curriculum to ensure it prepared soldiers for the realities they'd face in operational environments. Her visit would include observation of practical training sessions, review of student performance records, and individual meetings with soldiers who were struggling to meet program requirements. Translation: everyone needed to perform at their absolute best, and students like Mitchell, who were already on thin ice, couldn't afford any additional mistakes. The announcement created a buzz of nervous energy throughout the training company. Students who'd been performing adequately suddenly felt pressure to excel, while those who'd been struggling faced the possibility that a single bad performance could end their EOD careers before they'd really begun. Mitchell received the news with the same calm expression he applied to most situations, but Chun noticed his roommate spent even more time studying that evening. Santos used the announcement as motivation for increasingly realistic training scenarios. Instead of obvious training devices with color-coded components, students began working with equipment that more closely resembled what they might encounter in actual operations. The procedures remained the same, but the psychological pressure increased dramatically when working with devices that looked genuinely threatening. Mitchell's performance during these advanced exercises followed the same pattern he'd established since arriving. Obvious nervousness, fumbled procedures, and consistent failure to complete tasks within acceptable time parameters. During one simulation involving a briefcase device, he actually dropped the entire assembly while attempting to access the internal mechanism, triggering safety protocols that required evacuation of the training bay. But Rodriguez noticed something during that particular exercise that bothered him for the rest of the day. Just before Mitchell dropped the device, Rodriguez had caught a glimpse of his hands working inside the briefcase. For just a moment, his movements had looked smooth and confident, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Then something had changed, the confidence had vanished, and he'd fumbled the device badly enough to require emergency procedures. It happened too quickly for Rodriguez to be certain of what he'd seen, but the impression lingered. For just an instant, Mitchell had moved like someone with real experience, someone who understood the device at a fundamental level. Then that competence had disappeared so completely it might have been imagination. Rodriguez mentioned the observation to Thompson during their evening meal, describing what he thought he'd seen and asking if Thompson had noticed anything similar. Thompson considered the question seriously before responding with his characteristic directness. "I've been watching him since the first week," Thompson said quietly. "Something about him doesn't add up. His questions are too sophisticated for someone new to this field. His theoretical knowledge is deeper than the curriculum requires, and sometimes when he thinks no one is looking, he handles equipment like someone who's done it before. But then during official exercises, he falls apart completely. The conversation was overheard by Williams, who'd been struggling with his own confidence issues and was perhaps more sensitive to signs of deception than others might be. "You think he's faking it?" Williams asked. "Like deliberately performing badly for some reason? That doesn't make any sense. Why would someone volunteer for a program just to fail at it?" Rodriguez shrugged, acknowledging that he didn't have answers, only observations that didn't quite fit together. "Maybe he's not faking incompetence," he suggested. "Maybe he's hiding competence. Maybe there's something about his background that he doesn't want people to know. And acting like a beginner is easier than explaining how he already knows this stuff." The speculation was interrupted by Mitchell's return from whatever he'd been doing during their conversation. He settled into his usual spot at their table, contributing to the discussion with the same measured responses he always provided, neither confirming nor denying any of the theories that were beginning to circulate about his unusual combination of knowledge and incompetence. Colonel Hayes arrived on a Thursday morning with the kind of military precision that suggested she'd planned every minute of her visit down to the second. She was accompanied by a small entourage of staff officers and technical specialists, people whose job was to evaluate whether the training program was producing soldiers capable of handling the increasingly sophisticated explosive threats they'd encounter in operational environments. Hayes had the bearing of someone who'd earned her position through decades of competent leadership rather than political maneuvering. Her uniform was regulation perfect without being ostentatious, and she moved through the compound with the confidence of someone completely comfortable with her authority. When she spoke, people listened not because they had to, but because her words carried the weight of experience and expertise. The colonel's first stop was the classroom, where Torres was conducting a session on advanced triggering mechanisms. She positioned herself at the back of the room, observing not just the instructor's presentation, but the students' responses and engagement levels. Her presence created a subtle tension that elevated everyone's performance, a kind of pressure that revealed who could function effectively under scrutiny. Mitchell's behavior during the classroom session was consistent with his established pattern. Attentive, engaged, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated solid understanding of the material. When Hayes asked him directly about the principles behind pressure-sensitive triggering mechanisms, his response was comprehensive and technically accurate, covering details that went beyond what had been presented in class. But the real test came during the practical exercises that followed. Hayes positioned herself where she could observe multiple training stations simultaneously, watching as students worked through scenarios designed to simulate realistic operational challenges. Her evaluation criteria were known to be demanding, focusing not just on successful completion, but on the methods used and the confidence displayed during execution. Mitchell drew assignment to a scenario involving a simulated roadside bomb hidden beneath a vehicle. The device was designed to test systematic search procedures, proper use of detection equipment, and safe disarmament techniques. It was the kind of challenge that competent students should handle routinely, but Mitchell's track record suggested he'd find new ways to struggle with even basic requirements. Santos provided the briefing with particular attention to safety protocols, knowing that Hayes was evaluating not just student performance, but instructional quality. The scenario parameters were clearly defined, the equipment was functioning properly, and the procedures were exactly what they'd practiced dozens of times. There was no reason for anything to go wrong, assuming normal competence and attention to established protocols. Mitchell approached the exercise with his usual visible nervousness, hands trembling slightly as he gathered the required equipment. Hayes watched his preparation with the clinical attention of someone evaluating technical competence, noting details that would factor into her assessment of the program's effectiveness. Other students had completed similar scenarios successfully, so Mitchell's performance would provide data about how well the training prepared soldiers for realistic challenges. The initial phase of the exercise proceeded according to expectations. Mitchell's search procedures were methodical, if somewhat slow. His use of detection equipment was careful, and his approach to the vehicle followed established safety protocols. Hayes observed that his movements suggested someone following procedures he understood intellectually, even if his execution lacked the smooth confidence that came from extensive practice. But when Mitchell located the device and began the disarmament procedure, something changed. His hands steadied, his movements became more precise, and for several minutes he worked with the kind of focused intensity that suggested complete understanding of what he was doing. Hayes noticed the transformation immediately, recognizing the difference between someone following procedures and someone who truly understood the underlying principles. Then, just as it seemed he might complete the exercise successfully, Mitchell made a crucial error. He cut the wrong wire, triggering the device's simulation mode and failing the scenario completely. The mistake was so basic, so fundamental, that it seemed almost impossible for someone who'd been working so competently. Just moments before, Hayes observed Mitchell's reaction to the failure with particular interest. Instead of the frustration or disappointment she'd expect from someone who'd made an honest mistake, he displayed what looked almost like relief, as if the failure was somehow preferable to success, which made no sense in any context she could imagine. After the exercise, Hayes requested a private meeting with Santos to discuss her observations and get the instructor's perspective on Mitchell's unusual performance patterns. They met in Santos's office, a functional space equipped with the technical manuals and reference materials that supported EOD instruction. Sergeant Santos, Hayes began, "I've reviewed Corporal Mitchell's file and observed his performance during today's exercises. His combination of theoretical knowledge and practical difficulties is unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of evaluating EOD programs. Can you help me understand what you think is happening with this soldier?" Santos had been hoping for exactly this conversation, having struggled to categorize Mitchell's performance according to any framework she understood. "His theoretical grasp of the material is exceptional," she explained. "He consistently scores in the top 10% on written examinations. His questions during classroom sessions demonstrate sophisticated understanding, and he can discuss complex technical subjects with remarkable depth." Hayes nodded, confirming that she'd observed similar capabilities during the morning's classroom session. "But his practical performance suggests someone who's never handled explosive devices before," Santos continued. "Basic procedures that other students master within." Days continue to challenge him after 3 weeks. His hands shake, he makes elementary mistakes, and he seems genuinely nervous around equipment that should be routine by this point. The colonel leaned back in her chair, considering the information she'd gathered. In her experience, soldiers who understood theory but struggled with application usually needed additional practice and confidence building. But Mitchell's case seemed different, more complex than simple performance anxiety or insufficient preparation. "Has he provided any information about his background that might explain this discrepancy?" Hayes asked. "Sometimes soldiers transfer into EOD from specialties that provide relevant technical experience. Previous work with electronics, engineering, even demolition in civilian contexts can create knowledge bases that exceed what we'd expect from someone new to the field." Santos shook her head, acknowledging that Mitchell's file was remarkably sparse regarding technical background. His previous assignments had been in administrative and support roles that wouldn't provide exposure to explosive devices or related systems. He'd volunteered for EOD training without any obvious preparation or relevant experience, which made his theoretical knowledge even more puzzling. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Master Chief Torres entered with information that added another dimension to the mystery surrounding Mitchell. "Chief," he said, addressing Hayes, "I've been reviewing the security logs for our technical library, and I thought you should know that Corporal Mitchell has been accessing Reference materials that aren't part of our standard curriculum. Hayes raised an eyebrow, interested in any information that might explain Mitchell's unusual knowledge base. What kind of materials? She asked. And how is he obtaining access to resources that aren't assigned to his training level? Torres consulted his notes before responding. Advanced texts on explosive device analysis, counter-eyed techniques used by special operations units, technical manuals for equipment that's classified above his clearance level. He's been using the library during off-duty hours, sometimes staying until midnight to study materials that most instructors would find challenging. The information created more questions than answers. How was a corporal with basic security clearance accessing classified technical manuals? Why was someone struggling with elementary procedures studying advanced operational techniques? And most importantly, where had he developed the background knowledge that enabled him to understand such sophisticated material? Hayes made a decision. That surprised both instructors. "I want to observe Corporal Mitchell during one more practical exercise," she announced. "But this time, I want to create conditions that might provide better insight into his actual capabilities." Sometimes soldiers perform differently when they believe they're not being evaluated according to normal standards. The plan Hayes outlined was unconventional but potentially revealing. Instead of assigning Mitchell to a standard training scenario, she wanted him to assist with a demonstration exercise that would be presented to visiting officials the following week. The demonstration would involve a complex multi-component device that exceeded anything students normally encountered, requiring someone with advanced knowledge to serve as technical support. Santos expressed concerns about using a struggling student for such an important demonstration, but Hayes explained her reasoning. If Mitchell's theoretical knowledge was as extensive as it appeared, he might be able to contribute effectively in a support role. If his practical difficulties were genuine, the exercise would reveal that quickly without compromising the demonstration's success. The following morning, Hayes explained the situation to Mitchell in terms that made it sound like an opportunity, rather than a test. The Army was hosting a group of international observers who wanted to understand American EO training methods, and the demonstration would showcase advanced techniques used in operational environments. Mitchell would assist the primary instructor by managing equipment and providing technical support as needed. Mitchell's reaction to the assignment was carefully controlled, but Hayes noticed micro-expressions that suggested the proposal created internal conflict. For just a moment, something that looked like excitement flickered across his features, before being replaced by the nervous uncertainty that characterized his usual demeanor. It was as if he was struggling between genuine interest in the challenge and concern about revealing capabilities he preferred to keep hidden. The demonstration device was constructed to represent the kind of sophisticated threat that EOD teams encountered in high-intensity operational environments. Multiple triggering mechanisms, redundant safeguards, and components that required precise coordination to disarm safely. It was the kind of challenge that separated competent technicians from true experts, demanding not just procedural knowledge, but deep understanding of explosive systems. Mitchell's role was ostensibly limited to equipment management and technical support, tasks that should have been well within his capabilities, even given his performance record. But as the demonstration proceeded, Hayes observed that his contributions went far beyond simple assistance. He anticipated equipment needs before they were requested, positioned himself to provide optimal support, and occasionally offered quiet suggestions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the procedures being demonstrated. When the primary instructor encountered a complication that wasn't part of the planned scenario, Mitchell stepped forward with information that proved crucial to resolving the situation safely. His input was delivered quietly, almost reluctantly, but it demonstrated knowledge that exceeded what any student should possess. Hayes realized she was watching someone who understood explosive devices at a level that suggested extensive practical experience, despite his consistent failures during routine training exercises. After the demonstration concluded successfully, Hayes requested another private meeting with Mitchell. This time, she dispensed with diplomatic approaches and addressed the situation directly. "Corporal Mitchell," she began, "I've been observing your performance for 2 days, and I believe we need to have an honest conversation about your background and capabilities." Mitchell's response was carefully measured, the kind of non-committal acknowledgement that provided no useful information while avoiding direct deception. He expressed appreciation for the opportunity to assist with the demonstration and indicated willingness to discuss any concerns about his training progress. Hayes studied him for a long moment before continuing. "In my experience, soldiers who understand explosive systems at the level he demonstrated today don't acquire that knowledge through classroom instruction alone. They develop it through hands-on experience, usually under operational conditions where mistakes have serious consequences. Your theoretical knowledge, your questions during class, and your performance during today's demonstration all suggest someone with significant prior exposure to EOD work." She paused, allowing Mitchell time to respond, but he maintained the same neutral expression that revealed nothing about his thoughts or intentions. Hayes decided to be more direct. "Corporal, I'm going to ask you a specific question, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Have you performed explosive ordnance disposal work before your current assignment to this training program?" Mitchell's pause lasted several seconds, during which Hayes could see him weighing options and considering consequences. When he finally responded, his words were carefully chosen. "Ma'am, my official record accurately reflects my previous assignments and qualifications. I've volunteered for EOD training because I believe it represents an opportunity to contribute to important mission requirements." It was a masterful non-answer that confirmed Hayes's suspicions while providing no actionable information. Someone with nothing to hide would have simply denied previous EOD experience. Someone with legitimate experience would have explained how they'd acquired it. Mitchell's evasive response suggested he was concealing information for reasons he couldn't or wouldn't discuss. Hayes made a decision that would change everything. "Tomorrow morning," she announced, "you're going to participate in a special evaluation exercise, not a standard training scenario, but something designed to assess your actual capabilities rather than your ability to follow basic procedures. I suspect we'll discover that your performance issues aren't related to lack of knowledge or skill." Mitchell's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. The nervous uncertainty that had characterized his demeanor for weeks was replaced by something that looked almost like resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment and was perhaps relieved that it had finally arrived. The special evaluation was scheduled for early morning, before regular training activities began. Hayes had arranged for a device that represented a realistic operational challenge, something that would require genuine expertise to handle safely. She'd also arranged for the exercise to be observed by Master Chief Torres and a technical specialist from the Regional EOD Command, people whose experience would enable them to assess Mitchell's true capabilities. That evening, Mitchell's roommates noticed a change in his behavior that was impossible to ignore. The nervous energy that had characterized him for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm focus that suggested someone preparing for a significant challenge. He spent time organizing his equipment with a precision that exceeded normal military standards, and his preparation routine looked more like someone getting ready for an actual mission than a training exercise. Chun attempted to offer encouragement and advice, but Mitchell's responses were distracted, as if his attention was focused on considerations his roommates couldn't understand. When Williams asked if he was nervous about the special evaluation, Mitchell's answer was simple and somehow ominous. "Tomorrow you'll understand why I've been struggling with the training exercises. Everything will make sense then." Rodriguez exchanged glances with Thompson, both of them recognizing that something fundamental was about to change. "Whatever, Mitchell. had been hiding for 3 weeks was apparently going to be revealed during Hayes's special evaluation. They'd finally get answers to the questions that had been accumulating since his first day in the program. As lights out was called and the barracks settled into quiet, Mitchell lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling one more time. But instead of the uncertainty that had marked his previous nights, his expression suggested someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or consequences, and after weeks of concealing his true capabilities, he was apparently ready to discover which it would be. The morning air carried the distinct metallic smell of desert heat and equipment lubricants as Colonel Hayes arrived at the specialized training area before dawn. She'd chosen Building D for the evaluation, a facility normally reserved for advanced students working with live ordnance under controlled conditions. The structure was reinforced concrete with blast-resistant features, designed to contain incidents that might occur during high-level training exercises. The device waiting inside represented 3 months of careful preparation by the technical specialists at regional headquarters. Unlike the training simulators used for routine instruction, this was a functional explosive assembly built around components recovered from actual operational environments, diffused and modified for training purposes, but retaining the complexity and psychological pressure that defined real-world EOD challenges. Master Chief Torres arrived shortly after Hayes, carrying the specialized equipment case that contained monitoring instruments and safety systems. His expression suggested someone who understood the significance of what they were about to attempt, and perhaps some concern about the unconventional nature of the evaluation they'd planned. "Chief," Hayes said as Torres began setting up the monitoring equipment, "I want to be absolutely clear about our objectives this morning. We're not trying to trick anyone or create unfair testing conditions. We're attempting to understand whether Corporal Mitchell possesses capabilities that his training performance has failed to reveal. If he struggles with this challenge the same way he struggled with routine exercises, we'll have our answer about his readiness for EOD work." Torres nodded, acknowledging both the logic and the risks inherent in their approach. The device they'd prepared was significantly more complex than anything students normally encountered, requiring knowledge and skills that most trainees wouldn't develop until advanced courses. If Mitchell truly was the struggling beginner his record suggested, the exercise would demonstrate that quickly and definitively. But if he possessed the expertise that Hayes suspected, his performance would reveal capabilities that raised entirely different questions about his background and motivations. Either outcome would provide valuable information, though both carried implications that extended beyond simple training assessment. The technical specialist from regional headquarters was Dr. Sarah Chun, a civilian contractor whose expertise in explosive device analysis had made her an essential resource for advanced EOD training. She had the kind of deep technical knowledge that came from years of studying captured devices and developing countermeasures for emerging threats. Her presence indicated that whatever they discovered during Mitchell's evaluation would be analyzed according to the highest professional standards. Dr. Chun finished her examination of the training device and confirmed that all safety systems were functioning properly. The assembly was designed to provide realistic psychological pressure while maintaining absolute safety for anyone working with it. Multiple redundant safeguards ensured that even significant mistakes wouldn't result in actual danger, though the person being evaluated wouldn't necessarily know that. This particular device incorporates design elements we've encountered in recent operational environments, Dr. Chun explained to Hayes and Torres. Multiple triggering mechanisms, anti-handling features, and component redundancy that requires systematic analysis rather than simple procedure following. Someone with genuine expertise should be able to identify the key vulnerabilities and develop an effective approach. Someone without that background will likely find themselves overwhelmed by the complexity. Mitchell arrived at the designated time with the punctuality that characterized all his interactions with authority figures. But Hayes noticed immediately that something about his demeanor had changed overnight. The nervous uncertainty that had marked his behavior for weeks was absent, replaced by a calm focus that suggested someone preparing for a familiar challenge rather than dreading an impossible test. He carried his equipment with more confidence than Hayes had observed before, and his preparation routine looked more professional, more systematic. Instead of the fumbling uncertainty that characterized his usual approach to practical exercises, he moved with purpose and efficiency. It was as if someone had replaced the struggling student with a more competent version overnight. "Good morning, Corporal," Hayes said, studying his reaction for any signs of the anxiety that had defined his previous performance. "You understand that today's evaluation will be different from the training exercises you've been conducting. We're going to present you with a challenge that requires you to demonstrate your actual capabilities rather than your ability to follow standard procedures." Mitchell's response was measured and professional, lacking the nervous energy that usually accompanied his interactions with senior personnel. "Yes, ma'am. I understand this represents an opportunity to show what I can actually contribute to EOD operations. I appreciate the chance to work with equipment that more closely resembles real-world challenges." The confidence in his voice was unmistakable, and Hayes exchanged glances with Torres, both of them recognizing that they were dealing with someone who seemed genuinely comfortable with the prospect of handling sophisticated explosive devices. It was a complete reversal from the soldier who'd been struggling with basic training simulators. Just days before, Dr. Chun provided the initial briefing with the thoroughness that complex devices demanded. The assembly incorporated multiple potential threat vectors, redundant triggering mechanisms, and anti-tampering features designed to defeat standard countermeasures. Successful disarmament would require not just technical knowledge, but strategic thinking and the ability to analyze unfamiliar systems under pressure. As Dr. Chun described the device's characteristics, Hayes observed Mitchell's reactions carefully. Instead of the overwhelmed confusion she'd expect from someone encountering advanced concepts for the first time, he asked questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the principles being discussed. His inquiries focused on design philosophy, component integration, and countermeasure effectiveness in ways that suggested extensive prior exposure to similar challenges. The device itself was housed in a reinforced container designed to simulate the kind of concealment methods used in operational environments. Multiple access points, each presenting different risks and opportunities. Visual inspection revealed some components but concealed others, requiring systematic analysis to understand the complete assembly before attempting any intervention. Mitchell approached the container with steady hands and clear focus, his movements deliberate and confident. He began with a methodical external examination, using detection equipment with the fluidity of someone completely comfortable with the tools and their capabilities. His scanning pattern was systematic and thorough, revealing components and connections that provided crucial information about the device's internal architecture. Torres watched through the observation window with growing amazement as Mitchell's examination revealed details that even experienced technicians might miss during initial assessment. He identified power sources, traced circuit pathways, and mapped the relationship between visible components and their likely internal connections. His analysis was both comprehensive and efficient, demonstrating expertise that exceeded anything they'd seen during routine training. "This is remarkable," Torres whispered to Hayes. "He's conducting a threat assessment that would be impressive from a senior technician. His approach is methodical, professional, and he's identifying vulnerabilities that most students wouldn't recognize even after extensive instruction. This isn't someone learning procedures. This is someone applying advanced knowledge to a complex problem." Dr. Chun was equally impressed by Mitchell's initial analysis. Through her headset, she could hear him thinking through the device's design logic, identifying the most likely attack vectors and potential countermeasures. His commentary demonstrated understanding of explosive systems that typically required years of operational experience to develop. Hayes found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about Mitchell's background and capabilities. The transformation from struggling student to competent technician was so complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe they were observing the same person. Either he was the most gifted natural talent she'd encountered in decades of EOD work, or he possessed training and experience that his official record completely failed to reflect. Mitchell's approach to the device itself was revealing in ways that went beyond simple technical competence. He positioned his tools with the precision of someone whose muscle memory had been developed through extensive practice. His safety procedures were more comprehensive than what students learned in basic training, incorporating techniques that suggested exposure to advanced operational protocols. When he began working with the device's access mechanisms, his movements became even more telling. Instead of the careful, deliberate actions of someone following learned procedures, he worked with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood the underlying principles intuitively. His hand positioning, tool selection, and timing all suggested experience that went far beyond classroom instruction. The first major decision point came when Mitchell identified two possible approaches to the device's primary triggering mechanism. Standard training protocols would have directed students toward the more obvious option, following established procedures that prioritize safety over efficiency. But Mitchell chose the more sophisticated approach, one that required advanced knowledge but offered better chances of complete success. His explanation of the decision demonstrated thinking that impressed even Dr. Chun. He understood not just the technical requirements, but the strategic implications of different approaches. His analysis incorporated factors that most students never considered, showing awareness of how disarmament techniques affected intelligence gathering opportunities and follow-up operations. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chun commented to Hayes through her headset. "He's thinking like someone with operational experience, considering implications that go far beyond just rendering the device safe." His approach suggests understanding of how EOD work fits into broader intelligence and security operations. That kind of perspective usually takes years to develop. As Mitchell worked deeper into the device, his expertise became even more apparent. He identified and bypassed anti-handling features that weren't covered in basic training, using techniques that suggested familiarity with advanced countermeasures. His tool handling was precise and confident, demonstrating muscle memory that could only come from extensive hands-on experience. Torres found himself taking notes on Mitchell's techniques, recognizing methods that could enhance their standard training curriculum. Some of his approaches were more efficient than what they taught in class, incorporating refinements that suggested someone who'd learned not just from instruction but from practical application under real-world conditions. The psychological pressure that was supposed to test Mitchell's ability to function under stress seemed to have no effect on his performance. He worked with steady concentration, neither rushing through procedures nor hesitating at critical decision points. His breathing remained controlled, his movements stayed precise, and his commentary continued to demonstrate clear thinking throughout the exercise. Hayes realized she was watching someone who was completely in his element, working with equipment and challenges that brought out capabilities he'd been concealing for weeks. The struggling student was nowhere to be seen, replaced by someone who approached explosive devices with the competence and confidence that defined true expertise. When Mitchell encountered the device's most sophisticated component, a triggering mechanism that incorporated advanced electronic countermeasures, his response provided the most revealing insight yet into his background. Instead of the confusion that would characterize someone encountering unfamiliar technology, he immediately recognized the system and began implementing countermeasures that weren't part of standard training. His approach to the electronic components demonstrated knowledge that went beyond basic circuit analysis. He understood the operational principles, recognized the specific technologies involved, and knew exactly how to defeat the countermeasures without triggering defensive responses. It was the kind of expertise that suggested exposure to similar systems, possibly under conditions where mistakes had serious consequences. Dr. Chun's commentary became increasingly impressed as Mitchell worked through challenges that would stump most experienced technicians. "He's using techniques that are classified at levels above what his clearance should allow," she observed. His understanding of these countermeasures suggests exposure to intelligence briefings and technical analysis that's restricted to very specialized personnel. This isn't knowledge that someone acquires through routine training or casual study. The final phase of the exercise required Mitchell to coordinate multiple disarmament procedures simultaneously, managing different system components while maintaining awareness of their interactions and potential cascade effects. It was the kind of challenge that separated true experts from competent technicians, requiring not just technical knowledge, but the ability to think strategically under pressure. Mitchell's performance during this phase was flawless. He managed multiple procedures simultaneously, maintained perfect timing coordination, and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that could only come from extensive practical experience. His success wasn't just technical, it was artistic, in its precision and efficiency. When the final component was safely neutralized and the device was completely disarmed, Mitchell stepped back and began securing his equipment with the same methodical efficiency he displayed throughout the exercise. His demeanor remained calm and professional, as if what he'd just accomplished was routine rather than extraordinary. The silence in the observation room lasted for several seconds as Hayes, Torres, and Dr. Chun processed what they'd witnessed. Mitchell's performance had been so superior to anything they'd expected that it created more questions than answers about his background and motivations. Torres was the first to speak, his voice carrying the mixture of amazement and confusion. "Chief, in 15 years of EOD instruction, I've never seen a student perform at that level. What he just accomplished would be impressive for someone with years of operational experience. For someone who's supposedly been struggling with basic procedures, it's impossible to explain through conventional training pathways." Dr. Chun was even more direct in her assessment. "That performance demonstrates expertise that typically requires classification levels and specialized training that aren't available through normal military channels. He used techniques and demonstrated knowledge that suggests exposure to highly classified technical intelligence. Either he's the most naturally gifted individual I've encountered in 20 years of explosive device analysis, or he has training and experience that his official record doesn't reflect." Hayes studied Mitchell through the observation window. As he completed his post-exercise procedures, his movements remained calm and efficient, showing none of the excitement or relief that would characterize someone who just exceeded their own expectations. Instead, he looked like someone who'd completed a routine task competently, which raised the most troubling questions about what his actual background might include. The debriefing session was scheduled for the conference room adjacent to the training facility, a space equipped with recording equipment and security features that would allow for detailed discussion of classified technical subjects. Hayes had arranged for the session to be documented, recognizing that Mitchell's performance raised questions that might require review by personnel with higher security clearances. Mitchell entered the conference room with the same professional composure he'd maintained throughout the evaluation, taking the seat indicated by Hayes and arranging his notebook and pen with military precision. His demeanor suggested someone completely comfortable with formal debriefing procedures, which was itself noteworthy given that students rarely participated in sessions of this type. "Corporal Mitchell," Hayes began, "your performance this morning was exceptional by any standard we might apply. You demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that exceed what we'd expect from someone with years of operational EOD experience. I think we need to have an honest discussion about your background and how you acquired the expertise you displayed today. Mitchell's response was measured and careful, acknowledging the compliment while revealing nothing about the sources of his knowledge. Thank you, ma'am. I was glad to have the opportunity to work with more realistic equipment and challenges. It felt good to contribute something meaningful to the evaluation process. Hayes leaned forward, her tone becoming more direct. Corporal, the techniques you used this morning aren't taught in basic EOD training. Some of them aren't taught in advanced courses either. They represent knowledge that's typically restricted to personnel with very specialized assignments and high-level security clearances. I need to understand how you acquired this information and why your official record doesn't reflect the kind of training that would be necessary to develop such expertise. The question hung in the air for several seconds while Mitchell considered his response. His expression remained neutral, but Hayes could see him weighing options and calculating consequences. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen to provide information without revealing anything that might compromise security requirements. Ma'am, I understand your questions about my background, and I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that routine training exercises hadn't allowed me to show. However, there are aspects of my previous assignments that I'm not authorized to discuss without proper clearance verification and need to know determination by appropriate security personnel. It was the answer Hayes had expected, and it confirmed her suspicions about Mitchell's background, while creating new questions about why he'd been assigned to basic EOD training in the first place. Someone with the kind of classified experience that Mitchell's performance suggested wouldn't normally be sent through routine instruction programs unless there were specific reasons for the assignment. Dr. Chun entered the discussion with technical questions that probed the depth of Mitchell's knowledge without requiring him to reveal classified information. Her approach focused on theoretical principles and general methodologies rather than specific operational details, providing a way to assess his expertise while respecting security limitations. Mitchell's responses to Dr. Chun's questions confirmed that his knowledge extended far beyond what they'd observed during the morning's exercise. He demonstrated understanding of explosive device technologies that were still classified, countermeasure techniques that weren't publicly available, and analytical approaches that suggested exposure to intelligence assessments at very high levels. His familiarity with advanced concepts was so comprehensive that Dr. Chun found herself discussing technical subjects at a level typically reserved for conferences of senior specialists. Mitchell not only understood the material but contributed insights that suggested he'd encountered these technologies in operational contexts rather than just academic study. This level of expertise doesn't develop through classroom instruction alone, Dr. Chun observed. The insights you're sharing suggest hands-on experience with devices and situations that most technicians never encounter. Your understanding of countermeasure effectiveness implies that you've seen how these techniques perform under real-world conditions, possibly including circumstances where lives depended on successful execution. Mitchell acknowledged her assessment without providing details that might violate security requirements. His responses continued to be carefully measured, offering enough information to satisfy legitimate professional curiosity, while avoiding disclosure of anything that might compromise ongoing operations or reveal classified capabilities. Torres joined the discussion with questions about training methodologies and instruction techniques, recognizing that Mitchell's expertise could potentially enhance their educational programs. His experience suggested approaches to teaching complex subjects that might improve student comprehension and performance across the entire curriculum. But Mitchell's responses to training questions revealed another layer of his background that added to the mystery surrounding his assignment to basic instruction. His understanding of educational principles and curriculum development suggested experience not just as a student but as an instructor, possibly in contexts that required teaching. Advanced techniques to personnel with high-level security clearances. Hayes realized that they were dealing with someone whose background was significantly more complex than his official record indicated. The combination of advanced technical expertise, instructional experience, and security clearance implications suggested involvement in programs that operated at classification levels above what routine personnel records would reflect. The discussion was interrupted by a communication from base security informing Hayes that someone from the Pentagon was requesting immediate contact regarding Corporal Mitchell's current assignment. But timing was too coincidental to ignore, suggesting that Mitchell's exceptional performance had triggered attention from personnel who understood the implications of his demonstrated capabilities. Hayes excused herself to take the call, leaving Mitchell with Torres and Dr. Chun while she dealt with what was obviously a significant development in the situation. The conversation she was about to have would likely provide answers to questions about Mitchell's background, but it might also create new complications regarding his future assignment and the security implications of his presence in routine training programs. The call came from Colonel Marcus Webb, Director of Special Operations Personnel Management at the Pentagon. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive personnel issues at the highest levels of military command. Webb's first question was direct and revealing about the significance of Mitchell's situation. "Colonel Hayes," Webb began, "I understand that Corporal Mitchell has been participating in EOD training at your facility and that his performance today raised questions about his background and capabilities. Before we discuss this situation further, I need to confirm that our conversation is taking place in a secure environment and that personnel with appropriate clearances are handling any documentation related to his evaluation." Hayes confirmed the security arrangements and personnel clearances, recognizing that she was about to receive information that would explain Mitchell's unusual combination of expertise and apparent inexperience. Webb's emphasis on security protocols indicated that Mitchell's background involved programs that operated under strict classification requirements. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that require special handling," Webb continued. "Corporal Mitchell's assignment to your training program was part of a rehabilitation and reintegration process following his participation in operations that can't be discussed through normal channels. His apparent struggles with basic procedures were actually the result of psychological conditioning designed to suppress operational capabilities until proper authorization was provided." The explanation was both illuminating and troubling, suggesting that Mitchell had been trained to conceal his true abilities as a security measure. The conditioning that made him appear incompetent during routine training was actually a sophisticated safeguard designed to prevent unauthorized use of highly classified techniques and knowledge. Webb explained that Mitchell had spent 3 years working with a joint task force that specialized in neutralizing sophisticated explosive devices in denied areas where conventional EAD teams couldn't operate effectively. His missions had involved some of the most advanced explosive threats ever encountered, requiring techniques and technologies that remained classified above the level of most military personnel. The psychological conditioning that affected his performance was implemented after a mission that had resulted in significant psychological trauma. Rather than simply removing him from operational status, the decision had been made to maintain his capabilities while implementing safeguards that would prevent inappropriate activation of his training under routine circumstances. "Colonel Hayes," Webb said, "what you witnessed today was the result of proper authorization codes being provided in a controlled environment. Mitchell's actual capabilities represent years of training and operational experience that cost millions of dollars to develop and that remain essential to national security operations. However, his psychological state requires careful management to ensure that these capabilities are used appropriately." Hayes began to understand the complexity of Mitchell's situation and the reasons for his unusual assignment to basic training. The program wasn't designed to teach him EOD techniques he already knew better than most instructors. Instead, it was intended to provide a structured environment where his psychological conditioning could be evaluated and potentially modified to allow more normal function while maintaining the security safeguards that protected classified capabilities. The conversation with Webb continued for another 20 minutes, covering protocols for handling personnel with Mitchell's background and the security requirements that would govern any future training or assignments. By the time Hayes returned to the conference room, she understood that Mitchell's situation was far more complex than anyone at her facility was equipped to handle through normal procedures. Mitchell, Torres, and Dr. Chun had continued their technical discussion during Hayes's absence, but the atmosphere in the room had changed significantly. Mitchell's demeanor suggested someone who recognized that his exceptional performance had triggered consequences he'd been anticipating, while Torres and Dr. Chun appeared to be processing the implications of working with someone whose background was obviously far more complex than they'd understood. "Corporal Mitchell," Hayes said as she resumed her seat, "I've just completed a conversation with personnel at the Pentagon who provided information that explains your performance today and your assignment to our training program. What I learned clarifies many of the questions we've had about your background, but it also creates new considerations regarding your future training and assignment." Mitchell's response was simple and direct, suggesting someone who'd been expecting this development. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that my performance today would necessarily trigger contact with appropriate security personnel. I'm prepared to discuss any aspects of my situation that you're authorized to address and to comply with whatever decisions are made. Regarding my continued training or reassignment," Hayes explained what she could about Mitchell's background and the reasons for his unusual assignment, providing enough information to help Torres and Dr. Chun understand the situation while respecting the classification limitations that govern discussion of his actual operational experience. The revelation that his apparent incompetence had been the result of psychological conditioning rather than lack of training changed everyone's understanding of his situation completely. Dr. Chun was particularly interested in the technical implications of conditioning that could suppress specific capabilities while leaving general knowledge intact. The sophistication required to create such targeted psychological effects suggested involvement of specialists and resources that operated at the highest levels of military research and development. Torres focused on the training implications, recognizing that Mitchell's presence in their program had always been about evaluation and rehabilitation rather than education. His struggles with basic procedures hadn't indicated lack of knowledge, but rather the effectiveness of safeguards designed to prevent unauthorized use of classified techniques. The discussion continued for several hours, covering the security protocols that would govern Mitchell's remaining time at the facility and the evaluation criteria that would determine his future assignment. His exceptional performance during the morning's exercise had demonstrated that his capabilities remained intact, but questions about his psychological readiness for operational deployment required assessment by specialists with appropriate clearances and expertise. By the end of the debriefing session, everyone involved understood that Mitchell's case represented issues that extended far beyond routine training management. His situation required coordination between multiple agencies and specialists, involving decisions that would be made at levels of command far above the EOD training facility. As the meeting concluded, Mitchell gathered his materials with the same professional efficiency he'd displayed throughout the day. His transformation from struggling student to revealed expert had created new questions about military training, psychological conditioning, and the management of personnel with highly classified capabilities. But for him, it represented simply another phase in a career that had already involved challenges and responsibilities that most soldiers would never encounter. The evening brought news that Mitchell would be departing the training facility within 48 hours for assignment to a specialized evaluation program that could properly assess his readiness for return to operational status. His time at the EOD training program had served its purpose, providing the controlled environment necessary to test his psychological conditioning and evaluate his continued capabilities. His roommates learned of his departure through official channels, finally understanding why someone who'd seemed so knowledgeable during theoretical discussions had struggled so consistently with practical applications. The revelation that his difficulties had been the result of sophisticated psychological conditioning rather than incompetence changed their perception of everything they'd observed during his time in the program. Chun, Rodriguez, Williams, and Thompson gathered that evening to discuss what they'd learned and its implications for their own understanding of military training and personnel management. The discovery that someone with Mitchell's background could be assigned to basic instruction programs raised questions about how many other students might possess hidden capabilities or unusual backgrounds. But for Mitchell himself, the revelation brought a sense of relief that had been absent throughout his weeks of deliberately poor performance. The psychological burden of concealing his capabilities while appearing to struggle with procedures he could execute perfectly had been more challenging than any explosive device he'd ever encountered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but at least they would allow him to use his training and experience in ways that contributed to mission success rather than requiring him to hide his true capabilities behind a facade of incompetence. 2 weeks after Mitchell's departure, the EOD training facility received notification that he'd been assigned as chief instructor for advanced counter-IED operations at the Special Warfare Training Center. The position represented one of the most prestigious appointments in explosive ordnance disposal, reserved for personnel with exceptional operational experience and proven teaching capabilities. Chun discovered the news while reviewing personnel updates in the administrative office, and he immediately shared the information with Rodriguez, Williams, and Thompson. Their former roommate, who'd spent weeks appearing to struggle with basic procedures, was now responsible for training the military's most elite EOD specialists in techniques that most soldiers would never encounter. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Mitchell had endured weeks of mockery and doubt from instructors and fellow students, who'd assumed his difficulties indicated lack of aptitude for explosive ordnance disposal work. In reality, his expertise exceeded that of everyone who'd questioned his capabilities, including the senior personnel responsible for evaluating his performance. Santos received a personal letter from Mitchell 3 weeks after his reassignment, expressing gratitude for her patience during his time in the program and explaining what he could about the circumstances that had affected his performance. The letter included technical recommendations for curriculum improvements based on his observations of training methods and student challenges. His suggestions demonstrated the kind of insight that came from someone who understood both advanced operational requirements and effective educational techniques. Santos implemented several of his recommendations immediately, noting improvements in student comprehension and performance that validated his expertise in ways that his original training record never could have. Master Chief Torres found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about student evaluation and personnel assessment. Mitchell's case had demonstrated that exceptional capabilities could be concealed so effectively that even experienced instructors might completely misunderstand a soldier's potential and background. The experience led Torres to develop new evaluation protocols that looked beyond surface performance to identify students who might possess hidden capabilities or unusual backgrounds. His revised approach emphasized comprehensive assessment rather than simple procedure following, recognizing that some soldiers brought knowledge and experience that standard training methods might not reveal. Dr. Chun submitted a detailed report to regional headquarters analyzing Mitchell's performance and its implications for advanced EOD training programs. Her assessment focused on the technical expertise he demonstrated and the educational opportunities his insights provided for curriculum development and instructor training. Her report became required reading for senior EOD personnel throughout the military, serving as a case study in advanced threat analysis and countermeasure techniques. Mitchell's approaches to complex devices were incorporated into training materials used at the highest levels of explosive ordnance disposal education. Colonel Hayes received commendation for her handling of Mitchell's unusual situation and her recognition that his apparent struggles concealed exceptional capabilities. Her decision to provide him with challenging evaluation opportunities had revealed expertise that might otherwise have remained hidden throughout his assignment to basic training. The commendation noted that her assessment had prevented the loss of valuable capabilities and ensured that Mitchell's knowledge and experience remained available for advanced training and operational requirements. Her approach became a model for handling personnel with complex backgrounds and unusual assignment circumstances. 6 months later, Mitchell returned to the EOD training facility as a guest instructor for a specialized course on advanced threat analysis. His presence created considerable interest among current students and instructors who'd heard about his transformation from struggling student to recognized expert. His presentation focused on analytical techniques and countermeasure development, sharing insights that came from years of operational experience with the most sophisticated explosive devices ever encountered. The audience included many of the same personnel who'd witnessed his apparent difficulties during basic training, creating a powerful demonstration of how circumstances and conditioning could completely obscure someone's true capabilities. After his presentation, Mitchell met privately with his former roommates, providing what explanation he could about his background and the reasons for his unusual behavior during training. While security limitations prevented him from sharing operational details, he was able to help them understand that his struggles had been genuine psychological challenges rather than simple incompetence or lack of effort. Shun asked the question that had bothered all of them since learning about Mitchell's background. Why endure weeks of humiliation and doubt when a simple explanation could have prevented misunderstanding and revealed his true capabilities from the beginning? Mitchell's answer reflected the complex realities of military service at classification levels that most soldiers never encountered. The conditioning that had affected his performance was designed to protect not just operational security, but the safety of personnel who might be captured or compromised in hostile environments. His apparent incompetence had been a security feature, rather than a personal failing. The psychological barriers that prevented him from demonstrating his capabilities without proper authorization had been developed to ensure that classified techniques and knowledge couldn't be extracted through interrogation or revealed under circumstances that might compromise ongoing operations. His weeks of poor performance had actually demonstrated that the safeguards were functioning exactly as intended. Rodriguez observed that Mitchell's situation raised troubling questions about how many other soldiers might be struggling with challenges that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities or potential. The military's emphasis on standardized evaluation might miss personnel whose backgrounds or circumstances didn't fit conventional assessment methods. Mitchell acknowledged the concern while noting that most soldiers with his type of background received assignments that recognized their capabilities rather than requiring them to conceal their expertise. His case had been unusual because of specific circumstances related to his psychological rehabilitation and the need to evaluate his readiness for return to operational status. Williams asked about the psychological impact of deliberately performing poorly while knowing he possessed the skills necessary for success. Mitchell's response suggested that the experience had been more challenging than any explosive device he'd encountered, requiring constant mental effort to suppress capabilities that had been developed through years of intensive training and operational experience. Thompson wanted to know whether Mitchell had ever considered revealing his background to prevent the criticism and doubt he'd endured from instructors and fellow students. Mitchell explained that the authorization codes required for accessing his capabilities hadn't been provided until Colonel Hayes's special evaluation, making it impossible for him to demonstrate his expertise regardless of personal consequences. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics that ranged from military psychology to personnel management and the challenges of balancing security requirements with individual welfare. Mitchell's insights reflected perspectives that came from operating at levels of military service that most soldiers would never experience. As the discussion concluded, Mitchell offered advice that reflected lessons learned from his unusual career path. He emphasized the importance of recognizing that appearances could be misleading, that struggling performance didn't necessarily indicate lack of capability, and that some challenges required understanding context rather than simply applying standard solutions. His experience had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated evaluation methods could completely misunderstand someone's potential when circumstances created barriers between actual capabilities and observable performance. The lesson applied not just to military training but to any situation where people were judged based on limited information or standardized assessment criteria. Before departing, Mitchell left each of his former roommates with a recommendation letter that would prove valuable for their future assignments and career development. His position as chief instructor for advanced counter-IED operations carried considerable influence in personnel decisions, and his endorsement opened opportunities that might not otherwise have been available. The letters reflected his assessment of each person's individual strengths and potential, providing insights that came from someone who understood both technical requirements and the personal qualities necessary for success in challenging military specialties. His recommendations helped his former roommates achieve assignments that matched their capabilities and interests. Years later, Chun, Rodriguez, Williams, and Thompson would each encounter situations where their own performance was misunderstood or their capabilities were underestimated. When those moments came, they remembered Mitchell's example and the lesson that some battles were fought internally, against circumstances and conditioning that others couldn't see or understand. His story became legendary within EOD communities, serving as a reminder that exceptional capabilities could be hidden beneath apparent incompetence, and that the most dangerous weapons were often wielded by those who seemed least likely to possess such skills. The quiet professional who appeared to struggle with basic tasks might actually be someone whose expertise exceeded everyone around them. Mitchell's case changed how military personnel evaluated struggling students and assessed unusual performance patterns. His example encouraged instructors to look beyond surface observations and consider whether apparent incompetence might actually reflect complex circumstances that standard evaluation methods couldn't reveal. The transformation from failing student to recognized expert became a symbol of how circumstances could completely obscure someone's true potential and how proper understanding could reveal capabilities that seemed impossible based on initial impressions. Sometimes the most remarkable abilities belonged to those who appeared most ordinary, and the greatest expertise was possessed by those who seemed least qualified to wield it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.